By the time that he died in 814, Charlemagne had succeeded in creating the largest land empire that Western Europe had seen since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So, why were his heirs unable to keep this large empire together? In this video, I seek to answer that question as we cover Carolingian history from Charlemagne's death in 814 up to about the year 1000 or so. As students of history, it's often our first instinct to blame the collapse of a political order on the people who came after the founders of that order. So in this case, we would look to Charlemagne's sons and grandsons and blame them for the failure of the Carolingian Empire. But I think that there is sufficient reason to believe that the roots of this empire's failure actually lay in Charlemagne's reign itself. Now, by the time Charlemagne died, many of the problems which would plague all of his heirs had existed for a couple decades. Most of the conquests he made were not in the last few years of his reign, but had been completed by the 790s. So he'd had about 20 years or so to really straighten things out and get his administration right, but for the most part, the Carolingians hadn't done that. They had the power to maintain their control over the different areas that they had conquered, but they hadn't really done much to integrate these areas into the larger empire, and they hadn't yet gained the complete trust that they needed in the eyes of their subjects to be seen as the legitimate rulers of different areas. And for that reason, there would be frequent revolts, and there would be problems with different people within the empire that Charlemagne's heirs would have to deal with upon his death in 814. Another major problem for Charlemagne's realm was its sheer size and the fact that as a conquered empire, it had made many enemies, and those enemies were now surrounding it on all sides. So while most of these enemies were not all that powerful and they posed no real threat of being able to conquer the Carolingian Empire outright, all of them could harass it to no end and cause friction. So the Basques, the Moorish Spain, Arab Emirates of North Africa, the Papacy, Lombards, Byzantines, Slavs, Danes, Vikings, all of these powers could potentially present issues. In the case of the Papacy, the issue that they normally presented was that they were under attack and they needed help, and that required the Carolingian emperors to shift their focus to the south and neglect other things. After all, they have more than a few commitments, as you can see here. When we combine the sort of incomplete integration of the areas they conquered that we talked about before, and all of these different fronts that they have to defend, and then we also look at the fact that there are internal power struggles between people in the empire and also between potential heirs to the throne. This means that as a Carolingian ruler, you have to be prepared to fight a battle anywhere along your frontier or within your empire at any time. And you have to be prepared for there to be multiple wars to manage, and you'll only be able to be personally present in one of those wars. So this is a very stressful empire to try to run if you were going to be the emperor. So it might just seem like this problem is something that was naturally occurring and was something that the Carolingians simply didn't have the resources or ideas to deal with, and that's not really their fault in any way. However, they actually did make the problem worse because they engaged in identity politics. And the way that they did this was that the Franks would order each nation, defined by them, not by the people they conquered, to use their own laws. And they would tell these nations, hey, your nation is the nation of the Burgundians, you must use the Lex Burgundionum. And so they would force the people of southeastern France to adhere to Burgundian laws, which had applied to people living there 200 years before. Now, by that point, the Burgundian identity had long been lost. The Franks had ended Burgundy in the 5th century, or the 6th century, excuse me. And there's really not a very high possibility that this identity had persisted that long after being conquered. Now, the purpose of this identity politics was to make Frankish identity exclusive and coveted, and to provide some separation between the Franks in the kingdom and everybody else. However, the effect was actually the opposite. What we see is that political disunity within the Frankish realm increases, and it also prevents the formation of a Frankish political identity which would be comparable to something like what Rome had with Roman citizenship, where even if you are Assyrian or Spanish or Italian, you are all Roman because you have the rights and privileges of a Roman citizen. So by taking the opposite approach in order to really solidify unity among the governing class, the Franks really doomed themselves in the long run because they prevented themselves from being able to have something as long-lasting as a Roman Empire by really encouraging, quote, national divisions among the people in their empire. So far, we've just been looking at the issue of integrating people into the larger Carolingian state and trying to forge a common identity which would hopefully promote loyalty to the Carolingian political order. That's a little bit abstract. Let's talk more concretely, specifically about things made out of concrete. Now, once the Roman Empire collapsed in the West in the 5th century, this meant that the Roman bureaucracy went with it. So now you have no apparatus that is established which is good at collecting taxes or doing things like that. In addition, most of the old Roman infrastructure has been neglected for about 3 centuries now. People just don't have the money to maintain it. So a lot of that is in bad shape. This bridge here is from the south of France. It's a Roman era bridge. It stands, but it doesn't really look very useful since the top of the bridge has been worn down. So you don't really have the physical resources that your predecessors had that they could use to efficiently run an empire. And another thing that the Romans had that the Carolingians did not is literacy. Now, even within the church in this period, as we talked about when we talked about the Carolingian Renaissance, literacy is pretty limited. So you don't have a lot of people you can use as bookkeepers to study tax revenue and all that kind of stuff, and to do correspondence with different governors. So the governing class and potential governing class is small, and this will be something that will take a while to develop. You'll have to educate a whole generation or two before you have enough people to really change the way that you do government. And another feature of Rome that is now not available are cities. Now, if you'll remember from Rome, in Rome, government happened in cities and from cities. And cities were also economically at the center of the Roman trade networks. However, cities have been on the decline for centuries, and even though they're going to start to revive now that there's more order, the climate's getting a little better, and some other things are going right for cities, the old urban governance that had actually held up long beyond the city's almost entire depths, those old urban governments had fallen apart. So now you have no more city councils or traditions of civic leadership, the kinds of things that you would need to really get the cities going full force. So those things will have to evolve again, and this time basically from scratch. So the things which would have helped save the Carolingian Empire by making it stronger are not present. Now, that being said, a lot of these factors apply to all of the Carolingians' neighbors as well, so I don't want to feel like I'm just picking on the Carolingians. This is also why their weaknesses didn't make them all that vulnerable to outside powers and merely limited their effectiveness within their own borders. So, another area where the Carolingians kind of straddled the line between Roman and Germanic customs is in their use of the law. In Roman law, the estate was generally inherited by the eldest son or a designated heir. You could divide it if you wanted to. You could divide it however you wanted to. And there's a great deal of flexibility in how you can distribute your estate if you are a rich nobleman or an emperor. And we've seen that this law was carried over. I've talked about things in this course where we've seen Rome and Byzantium divided among different princes, but normally there's only one heir. And that is one of the strengths of Roman law, is that there's this flexibility for people to make sure that arrangements are made which are practical. Germanic law, however, always demands that estates be divided equally between children, especially sons, but also daughters to some extent. And there's usually not really an easy way around that. Generally, you don't have as many rights to deprive people of an inheritance in Germanic law. And while that is good for civilians, this becomes pretty problematic for rulers whose holdings will become weaker and weaker over time. See the Holy Roman Empire for details. So Charlemagne, this is something where he opts for Germanic law, and he never switches over to Roman law, even though if he wanted to keep his empire together, that would have been the move to make. And he lucked out because he only had one surviving adult son when he died in 814, and that guy was named Louis the Pious was his name, and he was Charlemagne's only surviving adult son at the time of Charlemagne's death, thus making him the sole inheritor of the Carolingian Empire. Louis was born in 778, and he began his career as a governor very early in life, and then he ruled as emperor from 814 to 843. He also was known as the Fair and as the Debonair. However, if you look at his picture, you basically see Butthead in a cloak. And for those of you unfamiliar with Beavis and Butthead, I assure you, this is exactly what Butthead looks like. Look it up if you don't believe me. Now, Louis was experienced and successful as a governor in general, as I said, and he had spent most of his time on the Spanish marches, so he had encountered the issues in the West, and he had experience governing in a militarized zone. So you would expect that he'd be pretty tough and able to deal with almost any challenge that he might meet with. And for the first 16 or so years of his reign, he's doing pretty well. But by 830, he's getting a little older, and at this point, he has multiple adult children, and they are really looking to secure their inheritance once he dies. To the point that they actually start fighting civil wars while he is still on the throne and is not really on his deathbed or anything like that. And basically the years 830 to 840 are the worst inheritance squabble ever, and Louis had the great misfortune of having to witness it in his own lifetime. So in 830, Louis had 4 adult sons, and all of them were eager to secure their piece of the pie, so they began fighting a civil war. These 4 sons are Lothair I, pictured on the left, Pepin of Aquitaine, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. Back then, people had cooler nicknames than they had in later eras where they were just so-and-so the number. And Louis was alive and well, but powerless to stop his sons from battling each other and wasting time and resources and lives on this squabble. And of course, he was in no position by then to change the inheritance laws because his father was the only person who would have had that ability. Since Charlemagne had such great prestige, he could have done almost anything he wanted to. Now, there's an uneasy decade of internal peace from 830 to 840 after that little civil war, and then the claimants were reduced from 4 to 3 when Pepin of Aquitaine died, so now it's just the other 3 brothers. And then when Louis died in 840, we have the 3 sons with armed followings and a Germanic tradition to back up their claims that each of them deserves an equal share of the empire. So I guess it's pretty safe to assume that the 3 sons of Louis the Pious were not on very good terms since they fought 2 civil wars against each other, one in 830 and another one from 840 to 843. Eventually, they all decided to get together at Verdun, and they signed a treaty which created West, Middle, and East Francia, their respective realms. However, they did not renounce the rights to any part of that empire since they were all still sons of Louis and grandsons of Charlemagne. And we would see that there were some people who were able to reunite the empire either by military achievement or simply by luck, such as one of the other branches of the family dying out and it being passed back to your branch. Charles the Fat was able to do that from 881 to 887 when one of the other branches of the family died out and he was the immediate heir. And then he got deposed and forced into retirement, and then his 5 children divided it amongst themselves. So this was basically why the Carolingian Empire was not able to stay together. There were too many claimants, and it would be impossible to limit the number of claimants without practicing something like what the Ottoman Empire did later, where when someone would come to the throne, all of his brothers or potential rivals would be put to death. So that wasn't going to happen, So without a system like that in place, or without changing over to Roman inheritance laws, the Carolingian Empire had no chance of remaining as one. So what are the long-term consequences of the failure of the Carolingian Empire? Well, when it divided into three parts, it quickly turned out that Middle Francia was completely unviable and indefensible, so that territory did not become anything. East Francia on the far side of the Rhine River, however, became the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually Otto I will be crowned as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome in 962. This is decades after the fall of the Carolingians in that area, and that empire will then have its own destiny, which we'll cover in a video very shortly. And West Francia will then evolve into France, but not under the Carolingians, who died out there too, but under a branch or a family called the Capetians. And then the Capetians would later have some cadet branches called the Valois and Bourbon dynasties. So that is basically how France and the Holy Roman Empire were created, is out of the failure of Charlemagne's realm. And this is how Europe begins to really shape up and start to look like what we know of Europe. And we'll talk about how some of the other stuff on the map, like Hungary and Poland, got there when we talk about the Holy Roman Empire.